So when we talk about the arena, we'll start with motivation, previous research, and the model itself. So when we talk about motivation, we want to map the ecosystem. This is an example of Rovio, the company that developed Angry Birds. Their motivation is to realizing that Angry Birds is becoming old, outdated, and its sales are declining. They want to identify new opportunities. So for that reason, they need to map the ecosystem to select appropriate areas to expand into. So they look at the gaming arena and break it into 4 sub-arenas: casual, mid-core, casino, sports. They sort them according to value, declining value. So the amount of money in casual is 7.4 in application purchases plus 1.9 billion in ad revenues. So altogether, this would be 9.3 billion. Mid-core is 9.2 billion, casino is 2.5 billion, and sports is 0.9 billion. And actually, Rovio is only interested in casual and mid-core because these 2 areas are both not profitable enough, and also the effort to get into them is excessive. So we'll only see analysis of casual and mid-core arenas. So now they drill down into the casual arena, and the casual arena is made out of puzzle, augmented reality, arcade, hyper-casual, simulation, and lifestyle. And each one of these sub-arenas is broken down into match and blast, word trivia, action puzzle, etc. When they look at these sub-arenas, they actually drill down 3 times in. The areas that are marked in red are areas where 2 games have 70% or more of all revenues. These are areas which would be very difficult for Rovio to invade because there are 2 gorillas dominating them, except, of course, for these areas which are dominated by Rovio itself, so that's irrelevant. So now we've seen the casual, and then they look at mid-core, which is the adjacent. They do a similar thing. They take the mid-core, they break it down into strategy, role-playing games, action, etc., and then they break it down furthermore. Again, red is where they do not want to play, and the areas marked by these rectangles are where Rovio wants to focus. And this is the roadmap. So that's the mind frame that we want for the arena model. If we want to analyze a visual model, the area that we need, the area of theory that we want to use is semiotics. Sema is Greek for symbol, and it's a theory analyzing symbols, and the map is a collection of symbols. So we'll be looking at 3 layers. The lowest layer is vocabulary. There's a set of symbols and terms that are part of this map. Think of it as a collection of emojis. The next layer is syntax. The way we put these images together, is it vertical, horizontal, concentric, what have you? So how do we link them? And finally, semantics, that would be the meaning that we can convey. So if we think about traffic symbols, this would be the vocabulary. If we talk about syntax, we put them one on top of the other. So for instance, if we look at these symbols, we might see the circle indicates that it's a rule, the U-turn, and on top of it, forbidden. So we take 3 images and we put them one on top of the other, and that's how we form this thing. And if we want to have several laws, we put them one on top of the other. So one way, no 3.5-ton trucks, and game area. So motivation for the arena model will start with a formidable 5. These are 5 giants who used visual arena mapping in order to communicate their formidable vision. The first one is Disney. This is a drawing made by Walt Disney communicating his vision. In the center. In the center you see the major forte of Disney, which is the theatrical films, and around it you see derivatives. So he wants to take the films and translate them into TV series, musicals, Disneyland, of course, and merchandise. The next one we want to talk about is Steve Jobs. This is from the launch of the iPhone. So if Disney was looking at markets that you wanted to play in, Jobs is looking at the competitors. So Jobs says we have the not smart cell phones, such as the Nokias, Motorola's, etc. We have smarter cell phones which are hard to use. And he looks at these phones that have these elaborate keyboards, and he says, I am smarter than them, I am easier than them. So Disney looked at markets, Jobs looks at competitors. The third giant, and actually one of the motivations for drawing this arena is convincing other developers to join the market. So here Jobs basically launches the idea of a platform where Apple develops. So if you look at the arena, he does an excellent thing dividing things into what Apple is going to do, the breakthrough platform, and the developers, which are all these heads that you see at the bottom. They do they have the creative insight, market knowledge, and entrepreneurial energy. So this is a beautiful and highly effective division of work. We focus on the platform, you focus on the applications, and as a matter of fact, the apps are the most profitable part of Apple's portfolio, in the sense that if you look at the iPhone, this is the profitability, gross profit index. iPhone, Mac, and App Store is incredibly profitable because Apple actually does not invest anything in these developments. So we had Disney map markets he wants to be in, Jobs map competitors, and here you see Jack Ma. We're talking. This is part of his initial public offering of the company. So he actually places this within the initial public offering, and what he adds is customers or buyers. You don't have a business if you don't have people paying money for your product. So what he does is he starts with the manufacturers, Chinese horses and manufacturers, Indian, American. These are his propositions. So on one hand, he has a wholesale marketplace, which combines these two. He has two types of customers: the manufacturers who use his platform to sell to the retail sellers, and then he has Taobao, which is used by the retail sellers to sell it to the consumer. So this is business to business, and this is business to consumer. And if we mention syntax, he has the flow. This is basically the Silicon Silk Road, where you see the flow from east to west. He does the same thing when he talks about the fulfillment, and later on when he talks about launching Ant Group, which was supposed to be a huge initial public offering that was destroyed by the Chinese government. So we had Disney show markets, we had Jobs show competitors, we had Jack Ma show buyers, and this is Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he is. This is from the document presenting the Bitcoin, and he's mapping use cases. And he's mapping these use cases because he wants to convince, this is an open platform, so he wants to convince developers to add more and more features to the Bitcoin arena. And last, okay, we'll skip, these are alternative crypto solutions. And last, I would name Ilya Sutskever. Ilya Sutskever is OpenAI's chief science officer. I mean, you have all these people signed up on this paper, but I perceive him to be the brain behind it. But so what he does, when we talk about OpenAI's ChatGPT, he draws the architecture of the OpenAI platform. And again, in this stage, it was aimed at convincing people to join the platform and add more functionality. So what we saw here was a number of, was 5 giant visionaries mapping their arena in order to communicate their vision. In addition, over the last 20 years, I've been studying presentations by CEOs, chief executive officers, to analysts to convince them to advocate their companies. So I accumulated 579 arenas. These are arenas drawn again by CEOs. And what you can see is that they are from all over the world, mainly from the US and Western Europe, but also from Southeast Asia, if I'm talking primarily Japan, Korea, a little bit from Africa, not much. We see this description of all the industries. It originally started from the energy with the idea of a flow, vertical value flow in the energy. Upstream, you find or discover sources of petroleum. Midstream, you communicate, you transport it across the world, and you distill it. And downstream, you sell it in gas stations, home consumer gas and electricity. But we have many, many examples from high tech, sports, travel, and even dental. This is the vocabulary. The syntax, we've seen many of them are vertical. As I mentioned, the vertical value flow is extremely popular because you start with some value. For instance, when you extract oil from the ground, you add more value, and finally, when you sell it to the buyer and the consumer, that's when the most value is generated. So this is very effective. And the semantics, why do they bother map these things? They want to show where they're positioned along the value stream. They show vertical and horizontal integration. They show diversification. They explain pivots that they do in the strategy. They want to show how they cut the middleman. They show recycling, geographical differences between the Chinese market and the French one. They show allies. They show the rationale for mergers, and of course, environmental, social, and governance consideration. So what we saw when we talked about the grammar, the syntax, we see that 243 of these 579 maps were vertical. Again, it makes a lot of sense. 188 were horizontal, and the rest were other. So statistical analysis shows that this 42% are statistically significant. So statistically significant, large number of executives actually use the vertical flow. Within the vertical flow, 87 of these flow up, and 156 of them flow down. So again, it's statistically significant that flowing top down makes more sense to executive common sense. And when we try to come up with a language, we would like to accommodate what is intuitive to these executives. This is an example of TransUnion. TransUnion is a company that does credit rating. And TransUnion shows how this term of verticals is very entrenched in executive lingo. Vertical indicates basically markets. So financial services is one market. Insurance is another market, arena. Public sector, another arena. Media, another one. And so the term vertical is very, very, very important. These are examples of companies that do not use the vertical. They use alternative syntaxes that we do not adopt. So if we want to move, so if we look at the literature, we can see, I will show three bodies of knowledge. The first of all is this is Lampel and Mintzberg, and they basically show how they map. Again, they adopt the flow from top to bottom, and they show various structures that we see on this notation. Then we have Jean Tirole. Jean Tirole is Nobel laureate, and this is from his Nobel lecture in economic science. And he analyzes markets. So U stands for upstream, railroad infrastructure, etc. D stands for downstream, and here you have the end users. So again, he adopts these notations. And the last and most significant of them all is Michael Porter. Michael Porter is the elephant in the room. He has three related models: the five forces model, the value stream, the value chain, and the clusters. And when we think about these models, and when we think about the five forces are a model that I do not adopt for several reasons. First of all, the vocabulary. Okay, so if you talk about the vocabulary, there are rectangles and arrows, arrows representing adversity. The syntax is that we are in the middle. We are in the middle, surrounded by our competitors, and surrounded by suppliers, buyers, substitutes, and potential entrants. And the semantics are basically myopic, passive, and aggressive. So if I talk about aggressive, if you note, all the relationships in this arena only talk about rivalry, bargaining, threats, bargaining, and threats. So if you think about evolutionary game theory, this only applies to what evolutionary game theory calls hawk, basically hawks staring at each other. So all the other alternatives of cooperation, or what is called in evolutionary game theory doves, where we do cooperate, are completely ignored. So there's no alliances, no complementers, no integrators, no joint ventures, no partners. So this really looks in a myopic way to a tiny area where we actually tear at each other to death. Another problem, it's passive. If you look at this, I mean, look at the arrows. We're basically being tormented by our competitors and by our buyers and suppliers, etc. The only single dynamic aspect here is potential entrance. We are in hell, and if it's not bad enough, we have more competitors entering this arena. So there's no initiative by us. Initiative could be new buyers, new suppliers, new products and services, vertical integration, horizontal integration, none of that. So again, a myopic view where we are completely impotent, abused by our arena. And finally, the model talks about five mystical forces. Well, in reality, there's no reference to environmental forces, social forces, governance forces, political forces, etc. So we can easily expand the five forces model to 10 forces, etc. So it's a model that actually is not used by any executive, for the reason that why would an executive want to tell analysts, look, we are impotent in hell? That's not so I cannot think of another model that is so discussed in academia and not referenced by practitioners at all. There's an example of analysis by a CEO of National Grid. National Grid is an electric company, and what he uses is somewhat similar to the five forces, but the opposite. Instead of being entrenched, being abused, he talks about accelerating ventures, investing, business development, innovation. He talks about expanding, exactly the opposite of what we saw above. This is Lambda development. This is a very, very, very large real estate project in Greece. And again, when they look at the environment, they look at it as forces, as strengths, and not as threats. So they basically say we work with world-class advisors and expert partners to mitigate risks. And also they talk about joint ventures, which are completely ignored, etc. So I'm completely critical of Porter's five forces model. Haier again talks about much more complex ecosystem partners, etc. Freyr is a company that talks about revolutionary battery solutions, and they say that they will have by 2025 the cheapest, the lowest cost battery. And the reason they will have that is because they have They have their own state-of-the-art production technology, which is important, but they leverage a deep partnership model to unlock value chain innovation and lower costs. So we cannot do that without the arena. And then they talk about catalyzing a Nordic ecosystem, again, using the ecosystem or the arena to create value. And here they look at their value chain partners, not enemies. So they mention some of them, and some they cannot even mention their name. They say confidential because this is such an important partnership. They do not want to divulge it. And this is the Scandinavian ecosystem, which again is key to their success. The second Porter model is the value system. So this is the value system. So you see suppliers, this is us, distributors and end users. Again, this model is problematic. The vocabulary basically uses these pentagon arrows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides. So the pentagon, there are no arrows because the pentagon is an arrow in itself. Horizontal flow from left to right, and a vertical, and what they use is the vertical value stream. So they basically show where they're positioned. What are the problems with this model? First of all, because they only use simplistic flow, it's a very superficial model. So this model is useful only if you want to explain to students what the arena is about. It's not useful if you actually want to map the arena. So the fact that the flow is so simplistic basically prevents you from actually showing different structures, different solutions. And the result actually is that executives who use the model, and unlike the 5 forces, this model is used a lot, they actually develop their own notation. So instead of getting a paradigm that everybody uses, we get Pigeon Porter. Basically, all these executives come up with their own Pigeon language. Another ridiculous aspect in the syntax, he uses the term vertical, but draws it horizontal. I mean, this is so Big Brother, where war is peace, freedom is slavery, vertical is horizontal, horizontal is vertical. So this is upstream and this is downstream, but it's drawn on the horizontal axis, which means that vertical integration is horizontal, horizontal integration is vertical. Why? I have no idea. And finally, he does not show players, but I would like to see how my different competitors are working in this market. If I am Ford, what is Tesla doing in a different way? What is BYD doing in a different way? So when you see this is an example of a company that is striving to be carbon neutral, again, they use the left to right, unfortunate notation, but you see that even here, it's much more complex than what we saw in Porter's notation. Fryer, again, we talked about them before. Again, you see that it's much more complex because you have cathode materials and anode materials and electrolyte materials, etc. And the same, and when you look at Volkswagen, you see what I meant when I mentioned Pigeon Porter. This is very much Porter's notation. So you have equipment and raw materials and battery cells and battery module and integration in vehicle. And that's what Volkswagen does. And that's what the suppliers are doing. But what Volkswagen wants to change in this arena. So here we're talking about an initiative to expand in the arena. They want to do vertical integration, but that's not what the model talks about. So first of all, again, you see that vertical integration is horizontal, which is weird. And of course, this is not the real notation that Porter is using, because here he describes suppliers and not invasion into the suppliers. So my question was, so I wondered, doesn't Michael Porter know what I just mentioned, the vertical value flow? Where actually, Michael Porter wrote the book called Competitive Strategy. And this book mentions the terms upstream, downstream, and vertical. They're mentioned on 15, 31, 91 pages. And they're mentioned so often that they're basically mentioned 24 plus 35 plus 149. So that's, I think, 208 times. So these are very important, very fundamental terms in Michael Porter's book, and yet he does not take this into consideration when drawing the syntax for the model. So again, we have a problem with a semantic noodle. We have a problem with the horizontal, vertical, etc. Here again, you see ThyssenKrupp using the model, but it's not good enough, so they need to expand it. This is a beautiful example of the confusion when I talk about Porter. Rather than creating a paradigm, creating a Tower of Babel, Lafarge-Holcim is a huge Swiss international chemical company, and the CEO, Eric Olsen, describes how they want to expand throughout the value chain. So this is clearly Porter's model, from raw materials all the way to end users. And their accent is that they want to be vertically integrated. So of course, vertically integrated in this case means horizontal. So this is the CEO's initiative. When Gerard Kufferbarb, he's a member of the executive committee, he actually draws it the way it should be. So he draws it in the vertical way. So you have one notation, you have another notation, and finally, when Oliver Oswald, he's in charge of Central and South America, draws it, he draws it from the right to the left in order to show that the flow of information, they want to do vertical integration into e-business. So you see, in one company, Porter's model is so limited that 3 different executives within the same company, they use different mappings. And this is a source for confusion rather than coming up with a canonic form and creating an understanding. Okay, the last model I want to talk about is the cluster model, which is, unlike the previous models, which were really myopic, this really looks at the arena. Unfortunately, Porter does not provide any legends, so you can only look at his examples to reverse engineer So Porter does not have a legend. All we can do is look at examples and analyze them. So here's an example showing the Italian leather fashion cluster. So here you have the tanning equipment and the molds and ski boots, etc. This is an example of tourism in Australia. And this is an example that I will go more in depth into, the California wine cluster. Porter's vocabulary consists of rectangles. These are the actors like irrigation technology suppliers, growers, and vineyards. Multi-rectangles, these are clusters like the California agricultural cluster, food and restaurant cluster, and tourism cluster. And arrows represent business transactions. The syntax has no orientation in the sense that in all these 3 examples, you can see flow from left to right, right to left, top to bottom, and bottom up. So there's no significant syntax whatsoever. And the semantics are, these are the actors in the arena that generate value. So it's to some extent the opposite of the 5 forces model. The first problem is that the model is sloppy. If you look, let's take an example. You have suppliers of irrigation technology, they supply it to the growers. The growers supply it to the vineyards. The vineyards also buy, say, bottles and caps. And then they buy the tourism cluster and food and restaurant cluster, which of course does not make any sense. Well, in reality, it should be the opposite. The arrows here should be from left to right. The growers sell grapes to the wineries, and the wineries sell to the food and restaurant cluster that sells to the tourism cluster. This is the small problem. Bigger problem, you see an alternative flow here. A bigger problem is that when you see the arrows from state government agencies to the growers and wineries, this is not a business relationship. It's not that the government sells something to the growers. It's in fact regulation. So this should be a different symbol because it's not selling, it's actually enforcing, say, like we see in France and in Italy and in Spain, where you have appellation contrôlée, things of the sort, so they make sure that other countries cannot use the same notation. So using this arrow and that arrow is wrong. Finally, the third problem is that you see an alternative flow of goods, whereby the irrigation technology is not sold directly to the growers, but it's first sold to the California agricultural cluster, and they sell it to the growers, where this certainly makes no sense at all. So let's try and understand what's going on here. So the first problem that I mentioned was the fact that this should not be a bidirectional arrow, but the flow is actually very clear here. The second problem I mentioned, state and government agencies are not suppliers, they are regulators. They enforce political laws, and they make sure that there is a good governance. And finally, when you think about this is the California wine cluster. So obviously the wineries are part of it. The suppliers are also part of it. The suppliers are part of it. The same thing is, by the way, true about their buyers and their buyers' buyers. So when we talk about the California agricultural cluster, obviously the growers are part of the agricultural cluster, because if they grow grapes, they are part of the agricultural cluster. The suppliers are obviously part of the agricultural cluster. By the way, so are their buyers and their buyers' buyers. So basically, the definition here is very, very sloppy. So obviously, it's not the irrigation is sold to the cluster and the cluster sells to the growers. They are all part of the cluster. So that's very bad. The third problem that I mentioned, the fourth problem that I mentioned when I talked about the syntax, about the patchiness of this model, is that if you have the value system, if it has any value, let's apply it in the cluster. If it has no value, let's get rid of it. What do I mean by applying the value system to this? The value system talks about an orderly flow. So at the bottom, you would have the tourist cluster, buying from the food and restaurant cluster, buying from the wineries, who buy grapes from the growers, who buy all sorts of equipment from grape stock, fertilizer, herbicides, harvesting equipment, and irrigation technology. So one of the big problems that with Porter is that he has models that are patchy and are not put together. Okay. So I think that was the major criticism of that model. So if I want to talk about the ARENA model, what I do in the ARENA model is I actually apply three, if I look at the literature used to, and one more thing about Porter's, all the models that I mentioned before have no academic value whatsoever. They have no academic value because they don't reference any academic research whatsoever, and they have no academic value because they do not report on any research that they conducted themselves. So from an academic perspective, they are non-existent. So when I want to develop the ARENA model, I want to build on two things. One, the research that I conducted, which shows how executives use it in the field. I would like to be as close to their intuition as possible. And the second is academic research. So the first relevant model is Euler's graph theory. So Euler is a mathematician, perhaps one of the greatest mathematicians, discrete mathematician, and he developed graph theory. So this is from Euler's book, actually, from 1736. And these are what I just showed before. This is Königsberg, and he creates graph theory. And graphs consist of nodes and of vertices connecting them. This is very natural for executives wanting to draw their business arena. If you remember much of what we showed, these would be markets or players within markets, and the arrows would indicate the flow within these markets. The second academic If Euler came from mathematics, this is Venn, and Venn came from logic. And he established Venn diagrams. Again, Venn diagrams are this is from 1880. Venn diagrams are very intuitive, very intuitive for mapping business companies, because many companies are both in various types of insurance or financial services. So this makes a lot of sense. This is an example by Carrefour, showing them playing in hypermarkets, supermarkets, and convenience. This is typical Venn diagram. Wells Fargo, a very large bank, talking about payments, virtual solutions, community banking, and wealth and investment management. Visa talks about different. So they all use Bed Bath and Beyond. They all use the same notation. And so the first one was Euler, who was a mathematician, Venn, who's from logic, and the third one is David Harel. David Harel comes from computer science, and he combines the two models. So basically, he takes Euler's graph theory, but instead of the nodes being a dot, what he does is he applies the Venn diagrammatic notation. So the dots are actually a hierarchy, and he calls this state chart because it describes different states. So this is an example where you can see arrows coming from the watch and alarm state. So this applies to everything within the state, but this arrow comes only from the month state. So you can connect things at the set level or at subset level. This is an example of Meta's cloud gaming infrastructure. It's drawn using this notation. Unreal, describing Fortnite, they're using exactly this notation, etc. So when I design the ARENA model, if I want to start by talking about the syntax, I obviously adopt the vertical value stream. This is a slide by AMEC. It's an oil company. Upstream, you discover oil or gas. Midstream, you transport it and you distill it. Downstream, you capitalize on it by selling it in gas stations, etc. And this is Alibaba. Again, he uses, when he talks about upstream, obviously it's up, it's at the top. Then you have suppliers, then you have the market, and you have customers, and use, disposal, and recycle. So again, the vertical value stream, up, top to bottom, which is so natural for a river to follow gravity, is so natural. This is a company in the pharmaceutical industry. They have these are the suppliers, 1,500. They market 30,000 plus products from these suppliers, and they have 400,000 potential customers, hospitals, rehab clinics, etc. So the syntax in the ARENA will be vertical top to bottom. What is the vocabulary? So we have three entities: markets, like the drug markets, the banking, etc. Firms, Teva, which is a player within this market, and regulators. And if we talk about relationships, we have a simple arrow that's similar to what Porter is using in the cluster model. Business, this is the supplier, this is the buyer. Control, this is what we should have seen in the interaction with the government, suppliers and buyers. And information, I will show in a minute how it's used. Information basically talks about flow of information. Vertical integration, no arrows, and horizontal integration. And so if we were to take, so what we can do, we can, if I want to take the California wine cluster, I would first of all apply the vertical value stream. So on top, I would have so this would be part of the California agricultural cluster. So within it, you see vineyard suppliers. That would be the grape stock, fertilizer, grape harvesting, and irrigation technology. They sell this to the growers. They sell this to the wineries. The wineries also buy from the winemaking. They buy winemaking equipment, barrels, etc. And then the wineries, of course, supply the product to the tourism, to the food and restaurant cluster, and to the tourism cluster. And of course, you can jump the connection or cut the middleman by selling directly to the tourism cluster. So here the arrow that you see is business relationship. I sell fertilizer, I sell grapes, I sell wine. The second arrow that we mentioned was flow of information. So educational universities and other trade union organizations, they provide, this is also part of here, educational research and trade organizations. Again, this relationship is not a business relationship. If I'm a university, I do not sell my information to the buyers. I teach, and the information is disseminated by itself. And the third relationship is what we mentioned before, the regulatory state government agencies regulate the agricultural and other clusters. So here we combine all three, actually four models, by using so this is the cluster. Within the cluster, we apply the value system. Within the value system, we can see the five forces: competitors, suppliers, substitutes, and new entrants, in fact, are not a distinct entry. If you think about Venn diagrams, they're actually one subcategory within competitors. So they should actually be there. And there's another Porter model that I did not mention before, which is generic strategies. So within a market, you can break it down into cost leadership, differentiation, cost focus, and differentiation focus. So that I think that's basically it. Okay.